In the art of war, in the theatre of war. Actually, I must confess, because I've done a pile of videos this morning, and all of them didn't have any sound. So I put things up, and I've been making a stack of videos, and they're all pointless. But for some reason, my computer sound keeps switching off. I don't know whether whether somebody's managed to hack their way into my computer. It wouldn't greatly surprise me, some sort of censorship at point zero. But I hope things are better now. But as saying, in the theatre of war. In the theatre of war, peace can be just as weaponized as in any combat zone. Drones can be deployed. In addition to being blatantly false, Russia's claim that it will maintain a limited truce, especially in the Black Sea, is clearly misleading. What we are seeing is a rerouting of hostilities rather than their de-escalation. And Moscow is using sleight of hand, le jeu de main, prestidigitation. Moscow, the Kremlin, is being as inventive and as distracting as David Copperfield. And this isn't to slight Miriam Margolyes and the great Victorian author Dickens. This is the other David Copperfield, the one from the Las Vegas, the wonderful David Copperfield. I don't think David Copperfield is actually performing anymore. But David Copperfield, Putin, this man with a body double. Body doubles, of course, work very well in magic. This man with a body double, this is all stage trickery. We don't know whether Putin is alive or dead. We don't know. It's Schrodinger's cat. It's a magic trick, isn't it? It's a magic trick. And Moscow is using all the tricks of the cheap stage magician to prosecute terror in one area while pretending to be diplomatic in another. Russia conducted a massive nocturnal attack, a night attack, on several Ukrainian cities, including but not limited to Kharkiv, Dnipro, Sumy, and the town where Zelensky grew up just days ago. At least 23 people were hurt, including a toddler in Kharkiv alone. In Petrovsk, residential structures, houses and cultural institutions were destroyed. Civilian targets, not military targets. An elderly resident suffered injuries. In Kherson, a drone intentionally targeted an elderly woman, a pensioner. Think of it, a drone attack on an old person going down the street. This isn't new, by the way. This isn't new. Calum Robertson, I identified this and filmed this months ago and put out his documentary on YouTube, being chased down the street by a drone carrying a grenade. He witnessed grenades falling into cars, and he was chased down the street as well by a drone following his taxi. And then a few weeks later, the BBC went to Kherson and did exactly the same footage. They copied his footage. I believe they took his footage to the organisation that gives permission to go into Kherson and said, look, you want to make something like this. They didn't attribute their sources, of course, but Calum Robertson was the first in Kharkiv, and it's still going on. And it's a shame that the BBC hasn't acknowledged that this is routine. This isn't a one-off. This is routine. This is what Moscow is encouraging. This is what the Kremlin is encouraging. Not to attack military targets, but to attack civilians, to demoralize civilians. All this occurring on the same day that Russia was celebrating agreeing to a ceasefire on energy infrastructure. Russia isn't seeking peace, as Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal so eloquently put it. Russia is still terrorizing people, ordinary civilians. This is sadism with a strategic playbook. It's not war. It's not a civilized war. To be clear, these are not wartime incidents. These are attacks on national infrastructure and civilian population. They are designed to undermine the Ukrainian morale. This is purposeful, it's well planned. This isn't something. This isn't an impulse suddenly that suddenly attacks some aberrant Russian soldiers. This is planned. This is months, weeks, years in the making. This is intended to instill fear, to erode the integrity of the government and eventually weaken the Ukrainian people's will. And it's now difficult for even the most composed voices to remain diplomatically hopeful. Speaking in Paris, Sir Keir Starmer called Putin's promises hollow and charged that the Kremlin was playing games with the ceasefire agreement. Of course the Kremlin is playing games. He's correct. Russia's strategies resemble a masterclass in manipulation rather than a quest for peace. And it's critical to acknowledge the political theatre being used here. The United States mediated the truce, which is based on reciprocal pledges to refrain from attacking energy infrastructure and to stop war in the Black Sea. However, the drones were in the air before the ink had even dried. Moscow maintains that any violation renders the deal void. Exactly like Minsk. Yet Moscow claims that Ukraine violated the Minsk agreement. No, Russia was already violating that agreement. Both of them. According to Moscow, any breach is interpreted with the moral flexibility of a stage magician. Whew! Now you see it. Now you don't. Now we've got a ceasefire. No, we haven't. The list of requirements for collaboration provided by the Kremlin, meanwhile, is a parody of diplomacy. Russia requests the elimination of limitations on the shipment of fertilizer, banking access through SWIFT, and the lifting of sanctions on its agricultural exports. To put it another way, they're continuing to bomb civilians while using their own acts of violence to achieve financial advantage, inflicting terror, suing for peace, controlling the process, taking advantage of goodwill among nations to obtain concessions. These are all examples of strategic barbarity. And when Ukrainian President Zelensky described the drone strikes as a clear signal to the whole world that Russia is not interested in pursuing genuine peace, he's entirely correct. International reactions now are showing signs of dissonance. Rightly so. The United States has mediated negotiations in an attempt to achieve some degree of de-escalation. Great! But the effectiveness of the agreement depends on the reliability of an aggressor who has consistently disregarded convention, agreements, and the truth. When someone picks your pocket, that person isn't actually shaking hands with you. That person is stealing your money, whether they've got a smile on their face or not. The smiler with the dagger. Even more cynically, Russia pursues its pursuit of what it refers to as justice by holding trials in tribunals that appear to be legitimate for seized Russian soldiers, for seized Ukrainian soldiers, many of whom are members of the Azov regiment. Propaganda, not justice. And propaganda for the Russian population, not propaganda for the West. We've been deceived for so long thinking that Russia's propaganda is aimed at us. It's not. Russia's propaganda is aimed at Russia. That's the goal of these proceedings, to convince Russians that all these sacrifices, all the deaths of their children are worthwhile. They're not. They're not. They're being deceived as much as we are being deceived. Vladimir Putin's defining tactic is this hybrid warfare against his own people and against us, which combines airstrikes with arbitration, drones with diplomacy, which masks truth. It undermines confidence in multilateral peace procedures worldwide, as well as in Ukraine, as well as in Russia. It erodes confidence in diplomacy as a workable solution, as well as in Russians' intentions. We need to identify this as what it is. It's a horror. It's a horror as surely as Dracula re-arising from the grave, because Putin, whether he's dead or alive, whether he's in the Smeg fridge or hiding in some sort of in some sort of underground bunker, it doesn't matter. He has died to humanity, and he has become a horror. Dracula rises from the grave, the satanic rites of Dracula, taste the blood of Dracula, Dracula AD 72. It's all the same. In the end, Christopher Lee gave up talking. He just appeared on movie. movie after movie. Where was it even him? Might have been a doppelganger. The ceasefire is a public relations ploy. It's a sequel after sequel after sequel to hide ongoing war crimes. It's not a peace agreement. Moscow is enhancing one front while suppressing another. The objective is still the same: to use deceit to splinter Western unity and to punish Ukraine for its disobedience and for its daring not to capitulate to the master. Peace needs more than paper. Credibility is a necessary part of peace. The Kremlin has lost that because of its ceaseless attacks on civilians. Those attacks are documented long ago. We need to recognize that the first casualty of this war was truth, and that went in the early part of this century. It's taken us a long time to recognize that. I lived in Moscow for years. I like Russia a lot. Russia is not the problem. The problem is the Russian elite, the Russian authorities in the Kremlin. That is the problem. And the Russians know that. They know they're not going to get any truth out of their authorities. They know they are being deceived just as surely as we are, just as surely as Ukraine is. In the end, everybody hungers for truth.